Hello everybody, welcome to episode 8 of Beach Walk Blog, where I go for a walk on the beach, which is one of my favourite things to do, and I get to talk and ramble about things to do with running, which is fabulous. So today we're going to talk about the knee, and we're going to talk about the knee in gait. Now this is something I see a lot, which is knee pain, dysfunctions of the knee. And when we talk about dysfunctions, what we're really talking about is the ability to perform a function or the inability to perform a function. So dysfunction is pretty simple. It's just basically saying, does my body or does this joint do what it's supposed to do? Now when we look at somebody walking or running, what we've got to think about is there a torque being produced by the body during the gait cycle which shouldn't be produced? Now that might be going over some of your heads right now. Torque is a rotational force around a pivot point. So that, of course, everything in the body is rotation. We've talked about that before. Every movement is a rotational movement. There can't be movement without rotation. So every movement we make is torque related. Now the question is it a good torque or is it a bad torque? i.e., is the torque in the right direction or is that torque being produced in the wrong direction? Now, most runners at some point in their running life will develop some form of knee pain. And I've talked about different parts of the movement of gait relative or respective of the knee, and one of the big things that I see a lot is this thing called medial heel whip. So what that is when the foot comes off the ground, so you've just gone past toe off, when the foot comes off the ground, the heel deviates towards the midline of the body. So if your right foot is coming off the ground just after toe off, your right heel deviates to the left. So the heel goes to the midline and the toes point outwards. Now, that is something that really we don't want to happen or shouldn't happen. And what that's telling us is either there's a restriction at the hip or there's a restriction at the knee. Now the knee has this mechanism called a screw home mechanism, or a rotational component, a rotational capacity. And the muscles that surround the knee, one muscle in particular called the Popliteus, is a big part of that movement of the knee. Now we don't need to really think about the screw home mechanism because that happens at very, very late stage of extension. And in running gait, you're very rarely, in fact you're probably never going to get to that kind of a degree of extension on the knee, unless in forward swing phase, when your leg is out in front of you like this, you get to that point. But really you shouldn't be getting there. So when we see somebody with this massive overstride, they're probably using that screw home mechanism. But most of the time in gait, in fact all of the time in running gait, in endurance running gait, the knee should be bent. Even when you land, that knee should be bent. So we're never really getting to that screw home mechanism, that final few degrees of extension. So that's not something we need to think about so much. However, when the foot comes off the ground just after toe off, if we see this medial heel whip, then we've got to think, why is that happening? Why is the foot not able to basically stay straight, i.e. the toes pointing down towards the ground? Well, usually it's going to be this imbalance at the knee. So a lot of people talk about an imbalance at the hip. Today I'm talking about an imbalance at the knee. So the imbalance at the knee is usually going to be something to do with the Popliteus muscle, and the Popliteus muscle either being locked long, taut long, so it just can't do what it's supposed to do. And why would that happen? Well, because something else is too strong and it's overpowering it. Usually that would be the bicep femoris, either the short head or maybe even the long head, or too much power in the vastus lateralis, externally rotating the knee. And if you're a cyclist, that's something you know a lot about, or it could also be coming from the glute max as well. So there's a few different structures there that are going to cause that imbalance, but the popliteus is going to end up in a real troubled situation. Now we need that knee to be able to produce internal and external rotation. Now if you're somebody who's done a crazy amount of squats, you're never going to get to use your popliteus, because pretty much every time I go walking through a gym, I see people doing squats with their feet pointing outwards, with their knees way out there in an abducted position. So wide knees, wide feet stance, knees point outwards, toes point outwards. And what you're getting is a drastic overuse of your external rotators and abductors, which is really not good for somebody who is a runner. And I know I've said this however many times I've said it, but these are really simple things that in a runner we don't want to have. We don't want to have these imbalances. We don't want to have these overpowered external rotators and abductors, because if you can't internally rotate, then you don't have the mechanism to generate torque through your gait cycle. So when your foot hits the ground, it needs to, we need to be able to produce internal rotation forces so that your leg becomes almost like just like a pogo stick almost, because the spring action in the leg is really like a pogo stick. Now we shouldn't be generating loads and loads of force. We're not trying to drive and power off the leg, because the leg, we're not trying to make it into a jumping movement. We're trying to make it into a springing movement with a slinging action over the top. So that's why I always describe gait as slings and springs. So your slings are what give you that rotational torque, that smooth slinging component from one leg to the other, and your springs are your thick tendons and thick fascia. So the plantar fascia, the Achilles tendon, the IT band, those are the ones that are giving you all that springing energy return system. So if we don't have internal rotation at the knee, and we're not generating the force to hold that knee straight, then we're gonna end up with problems at the knee. And you know, we see this in runners all the time. You know, these knee pains. I got lateral knee pain, and I've been diagnosed with IT band syndrome. Well, it's a really kind of a cheap diagnosis in my opinion. Oh, you got IT band syndrome, it must be that because it's lateral knee pain. Well, you've got to look at how the knee is functioning and how the leg moves during the gait cycle in order to know what's going on. Because just having a runner, you know, say that they've got IT band syndrome, or being diagnosed with IT band syndrome just from a bunch of symptoms without actually looking at how they run, like I said, it's just a cheap diagnosis in my opinion. It's just not, it's not really assessing, it's really just guessing. And I say that all the time, you know, if you're not assessing, you're just guessing. So going back to the knee, you've got lateral knee pain, you've got IT band syndrome, okay, or you've been diagnosed with a diagnosis of IT band syndrome. Well, what other things could it be? It could be IT band syndrome, or it might not be. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at all the possibilities, the differential diagnoses, all the possibilities that could be causing a lateral knee pain. And one of them is, if I see that medial heel whip when I've done the gait analysis, the first thing I'm going to is the popliteus. Now the popliteus is a super interesting muscle because it actually attaches to the lateral meniscus of the knee. It actually attaches to the meniscus itself. That is crazy. It's really cool, but it's crazy. Why would it do that? Well, because it has to be a part of this unlocking mechanism, and the first thing it has to unlock is the larger of the epicondyles in the knee, and it has to provide a torque to that knee, a direct torque to the knee. Now, the popliteus is the only muscle that influences the knee on its own. It's the only muscle that crosses the knee directly. That in itself is really cool because it becomes a single joint muscle. Where you think of the gastroc is a two joint muscle, crosses the knee, goes above the knee, attaches into the femur, and it crosses the ankle because it attaches into the Achilles tendon, so it influences the plantar flexion of the ankle. And then you've got the hamstrings, which also cross the knee and the hip. Okay, so these are all two joint muscles, but the popliteus is a single joint muscle of pure rotational capability. So if I see or hear of a runner with lateral knee pain, the first thing I'm going to go to is the structural analysis, i.e. the gait analysis. I'm going to look at how you move, look at how you run, and I'm going to say, well, do you have medial heel whip? Do your toes point out? Do you do lots of squats? How do you sit? Do you sit with that leg out in front of you like that? Right? These are all external rotation movements or situations that are putting that knee into a shortened, externally rotated state, and that's going to compromise and affect the ability to internally rotate. But that's also going to affect how the hip moves, but it's more than likely going to affect how the ankle and the foot move. Right? So that's why all of this at the knee is really important. It's super important. Now, when we hit the ground, when our foot hits the ground, we must be producing an internal rotation action from the hip, the pelvis, and then all the way down to the foot, so that we can then get pronation. Now remember, part of the foot action is pronation, but part of the foot action is supination, and we've got the we've got the midfoot that pronates first, the forefoot that pronates after it, but then while the forefoot is in pronation, the midfoot goes into supination, which then goes back up the leg as an external rotation force, and that unlocks the knee. So in late stance, we should get that unlocking of the knee as we're unloading the stance leg. Now the stance leg is not loaded. It's loaded, but it's starting to unload as we go through late stance and into toe off. Because remember, your foot's behind you. You can't be having that much weight on it. But the forefoot does, and the toes do. But the knee starts to unlock. And then as the foot comes off the ground, the knee must be able to bend. Right? So the knee must be able to bend. And that bending action is a part of the internal rotation mechanism of that knee. So the femur externally rotates, the tibia internally rotates, or at least it should be. And that prevents us from getting that medial heel whip. Now, part of that could be coming from an overactive external rotator of the hip. Okay, so it's not always going to be the popliteus, but chances are that's going to be a part of the equation. So there's other stuff going on there at the knee, of course, but that's going to be the big one. That's going to be the main one. So looking into that popliteus muscle, it's pretty easy to do. You just get your anatomy textbook out or Google it, go onto Wikipedia, have a look at how it is and how it orientates itself, on the knee, or above the knee, below the knee. It crosses the knee joint, so it must come from above on the outside, laterally on the superior aspect of the knee, and then medially on the inferior aspect of the knee, so the tibia. So it goes from lateral side above the knee to medial side below the knee, and it produces that internal rotation action. So we go back to gait analysis, because if you're not assessing, then you're pretty much guessing. So we need to do that gait analysis to see really what's going on when you are running. Because if you're not assessing and you're just guessing, you're going to be guessing for a long time, because the chances are that you're going to still think that you've got IT band syndrome and that everything revolves around the IT band. And although the IT band is a big part of the knee and the hip function, it's not everything. And none of that's going to work very well anyway if the posture's not very good, or you can't access different postures. Again, posture is a dynamic thing. It's a wholly dynamic thing, and if you can't get in and out of certain postures, i.e. you're stuck in a posture, that applies to your knee, because posture isn't just about your spine. Posture is global. Posture is everything. Your neck, your spine, your hips, your femurs, your tibias, your ankles, it's everything, right? So it's not just one thing. So when we talk about posture, what I'm saying is, can you get in and out of different positions? So can your knee internally rotate and externally rotate? And like I said at the beginning, if you've got a medial heel whip, chances are you probably can't get out of external rotation, because that's where you're stuck. If you do lots of squats, chances are that that's where you're going to go to. You're going to go to that movement because you train that movement. So you're going to just end up in an external tibial rotation, feet pointing out, and you just won't get the toes to point downwards, or at least downwards, but maybe even inwards, because that is the major torque creator that I see in so many runners all the time. So let's wrap this one up. Let's make this one a little bit shorter, because we're just talking about one thing here, which is, how does your knee function? Now, of course, how does your knee function? That depends on how your foot and ankle function. It also depends on how your hip functions. But you know, that's a bigger part of the equation. But if we're just looking at how that knee is, then we're looking at whether it can internally rotate, externally rotate, and whether you have the ability to get in and out of those positions well. Because if we have that medial heel whip on one leg, it's probably, more than likely, going to cause the wrong action to occur at the pelvis as the other leg hits the ground. Okay, so the pelvis should always be rotating towards the leg that is just about to hit the ground, so that when it hits the ground, it drives the leg back, or it drives the pelvis over the top. It can't drive the leg back, because as soon as it hits the ground is in the way. It can't. So that's when we get the ground reaction forces, and we must be able to sling the pelvis and the torso over the top of that standing leg. So we need to be able to have the internal rotation force being generated. That's the anterior oblique sling. So that's the adductor, the internal oblique on the opposite side of the stance leg, and then the external oblique on the torso of the same side stance leg. Okay, so a little bit confusing there. The sling goes from one side leg, stance side leg, to opposite side pelvis, back to stance side external oblique to rotate the torso over the standing leg. So if my left leg is about to hit the ground, if my left foot is about to hit the ground, my pelvis should be rotating anti-clockwise before that foot hits the ground, and my torso should be rotating clockwise before that leg hits the ground. And this is what I was saying yesterday in my post, in my purple screen post, because I can't find a red screen anymore. Purple screen post, which said that most runners are spending too much time decelerating when they're on the ground because they're not accelerating before they hit the ground. And that is where this action of the oblique internal rotation sling, the anterior oblique sling, gets us. It gets us stability in the stance leg. It gets us the slinging action of the pelvis and the torso over the top. And if you're not generating that force, then you are definitely not going to be efficient. And I say that, definitely not efficient in your gait. Okay? Definitely not efficient in your gait. You might be producing your gait, you might be running, but you're probably suffering a long line of injuries and not knowing why. And if all you're doing is arbitrarily strengthening what you've already got, then you are strengthening in all of those dysfunctions that you currently have. Okay, and one of those dysfunctions, like I've said, and I've been saying over and over again during this beach walk blog, is the external rotation of the knee, the pronation action of the foot. Okay, most of us don't have a problem with pronation. What we have a problem with is the foot and the big toe being in the right place at the right time when pronation occurs, and then getting out of it. Because remember, once you've pronated, you've got to supinate. You've got to supinate that foot, otherwise your plantar fascia is going to be screaming because you're not getting out of pronation. Pronation is not a problem. Pronation is great, because if we don't pronate, then we can't absorb the shock and absorb the landing forces. But if you're not supinating after you've pronated, you're gonna have so many problems, because supination is what gets us off the ground. Pronation absorbs, supination drives off the ground. Okay, now exercise 1 in the runner's rehab, and basically all of the checklist teaches us, it actually teaches us how to pronate the forefoot and supinate the rear foot, the midfoot rear foot at the same time. Okay, that is what happens in gait. We pronate the midfoot, we pronate the forefoot, and then the midfoot rear foot supinates, which is what gets us off the ground. It gets the heel up and off the ground. Okay, but you're not doing any of that if your feet point out, and if you can't internally rotate the knee, and if you're not using your AOS, your anterior oblique sling. Okay, there we go. Beach walk blog number 8, all about the knee. I hope you enjoy. Take care. All the best. Bye.